There were 71 drums in the surviving catalogue. But this file begins with the one that was never meant to be listed. 5 generations kept it in a chest. No one struck it. Not once. Tromsø, March 2024. The drawer was not supposed to contain anything important. Cabinet 17. Drawer 4. A reindeer-hide drum, 14 inches across, lay in the felt-lined dark without a current registration number. The object had survived. The file had not. The catalog tag had detached at some point in the previous century. The drum itself, figures still visible. A central diamond. 3 concentric rings. A solar wheel in the upper register. Reindeer in the middle. A small archer at the eastern arc standard noaidi cosmology, north of the Arctic Circle. The auditor opened the drawer expecting an unidentified accessory and found a drum that had not been formally re-recorded since at least 1973. There was no current registration number. No accession date. No donor file in the digital system. The drawer above contained a brass vorby from a 1962 Karasjok deposit. The drawer below held 2 unidentified antler hammers. The drum had no companion file. A handwritten note from the previous curator, dated November 1973, drum, location uncertain, possibly transferred from Stockholm 1924, possibly earlier. The note was written in pencil. It had been overwritten 3 times. The first 2 layers said other things. They had been erased. The drum is identified as a goavddis, northern Sami for shamanic frame drum. Its companion tools, when extant, are a vorby, a small brass or horn pointer, and a drum hammer carved from antler. In ceremony, the noaidi held the frame in one hand and struck the membrane with the hammer. The vorby moved across the figures as the drum was struck. The figures were not decoration. They were the cosmography. The upper third recorded the celestial realm. The middle, the human world. The lower, the realm of the dead. Where the vorby rested at silence, that was the answer. The silence was not empty. It was the moment before an answer became dangerous. In 1609, the Danish king Christian IV issued a proclamation classifying the use of these drums as witchcraft, punishable by death. Norway was then part of the Kingdom of Denmark. From 1671 onward, Swedish authorities followed, prohibiting noaidi practice in territories under their crown. From 1716, the missionary Thomas von Weston and his associates conducted systematic raids through the Sami regions of northern Norway. The drums were considered, in his own words, the Bible of the Sami. He intended to remove that Bible. More than 100 drums were reportedly confiscated during his missions alone. Most were burned at the moment of seizure. A small fraction were sent south. The canonical documented corpus stands at 71 surviving drums. Ernst Manker, Swedish ethnographer, compiled the catalogue between 1938 and 1950. His census drew from museum holdings in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and a small number of private collections. Of these 71, only a fraction were repatriated to Sami institutions before the 21st century. The majority remained in southern museums. More were confiscated than survived. More than 100 reportedly taken during the von Weston mission alone, between 1716 and 1727. Earlier seizures from the 1670s and 1680s under Swedish authority added further. Most were burned at the time of seizure. Some were sent south as evidence of conversion. Of those sent south, an unknown number entered private collections, were lost in transit, or were absorbed into ethnographic miscellanies under generic labels. The corpus is an absence as much as a presence. A surviving catalogue does not prove survival. Sometimes it only proves that someone counted what was left after the burning. Catalogue letters from Stockholm, Copenhagen, Berlin, and Leiden record drums no current museum holds. Some are known only because someone wrote that they had once been seen. Many are recorded only as absence, referenced in older inventories, then never referenced again. The Tromsø drum was not in Mankers 71. It had been documented in 1924 and forgotten by 1973. Anders Poulsen was a Sami noaidi from Varanger, in eastern Finnmark. In 1692, he was tried for witchcraft after his drum was confiscated. The proceedings produced one of the most extensively documented Sami witchcraft trials in Finnmark's archive, including a transcript in which Poulsen explained the figures on his own drum, line by line, while in custody. He was killed by a jailer on February 11, 1692, before the verdict was rendered. His drum survived the trial. It entered the Royal Danish Collection in Copenhagen. In January 2022, after a formal request from the Sami Parliament, the National Museum of Denmark returned the drum to Ridderduottermuseet and Samiet Bjørkedavert in Karasjok. The case is documented. The drum is documented. The transcript is documented. The Niemi branch is not. The Niemi family is an apocryphal record invented for this reconstruction. The premise is straightforward. In 1689, in a Sami Sida north of the Tana River, a family received notice that a church inspection would arrive within the season. They surrendered the drum the parish register expected. They also did not. The drum recorded in the parish register was not the only drum in the household. A second drum, smaller, never used in ceremony, was placed in the storage loft of the family dwelling. The loft was where dried fish was kept. No one struck it. The first generation kept the drum because the law was death. The second generation kept it because the missionaries still passed through every spring. The third kept it because their parents had kept it. The third generation knew only one rule: if a child asked about the chest, the answer was not given in words. The lid was closed. The room was left. The question was allowed to die by itself. The fourth kept it because no one had ever explained why it was there. The fifth keeps it because the loft has not been cleaned. 5 generations. None of them struck the drum. The drum survived the first eviction in 1714, when the family moved north for grazing. It survived the partition of 1751, when the Stromstad Treaty divided Sami pastures along Russian and Norwegian lines. It survived the schoolhouse era, when Sami language and practice were suppressed in classrooms, and the drum became a thing the children were told never to mention outside the household. It survived the war years, when German occupiers searched the dwelling for radios and did not look at the drum because no one in the household pointed at it. It survived the modernization era, when the family moved into a wooden house and the loft contents were brought along, untouched, in the same wooden chest. The chest was opened in 2018 by a great-great-great-granddaughter who had never been told. She did not recognize the figures. But she recognized the rule around them. Do not touch it. Do not ask loudly. Do not make it answer. The drum survived because no one was allowed to make it speak. A drum that is never struck remains a closed passage. The closure was the preservation. The drums in southern museums were classified as ethnographic objects. They were stored, dehumidified, sometimes displayed under glass. The institutions that held them documented their provenance, their materials, their iconography. The institutions did not, in most cases, document what the drums had once been used for in continuous, present-tense terms. The Sami position has been distinct. The drums are not finished. They are paused. An instrument that is not in use is waiting. The 1979 Alta hydroelectric protests reshaped the politics of Sami cultural property. Sami activists fasted in front of the Norwegian parliament. The dam was built. The precedent was not. The Sami parliament was established in 1989. Repatriation requests began entering southern museums in the following decades, formally and informally. Most were refused or deferred. Some were granted. In January 2022, the National Museum of Denmark returned the Anders Poulsen drum to Sápmi. The drum traveled north for the first time in 330 years. It was received at Karasjok. It is now held by Riddarduarmuseet and Samiad Fjordkadavret, in the institutional care of Sami archivists. There remain dozens of drums south of the Arctic Circle that have not yet made the journey. The conversation about whether they will is ongoing. The Tromsø drums file was reconstructed from layered records. The earliest known reference is a 1924 transfer note from Stockholm, drum, possibly Sami, hide and birch, donated by private collector, no provenance note. The donor name was redacted at some point. By 1947, the file read, Sami drum, 18th century, ethnographic. By 1968, Object 47b, reindeer-hide. Ceremonial use. By 1973, the curator's pencil note read-only, possibly transferred from Stockholm 1924, possibly earlier. By the 1990s digitization, the entry was a blank field with the object photograph attached. In 2024, the storage auditor opened the drawer and found a drum that no current registration system could place. The auditor's first instinct was to assume the file had been lost. Her second instinct was worse. The annotations were not errors. They were a record of institutional forgetting. Each generation described less. Each generation made the previous description more uncertain. No one destroyed the file. They only made it smaller. The drum had remained the same size, the same weight, the same hide, the same hammered figures. The catalogue had become smaller. The drum had been silenced not at the moment of seizure, but slowly, across 100 years, by the institutions that meant only to preserve it. They had preserved the object. They had let the meaning recede on its own. What is preserved is not always what was intended for preservation. Two drums, in this archive, occupy parallel silences. The Tromsø drum, in Cabinet 17, Drawer 4, is silent because the institution that holds it has slowly forgotten what it was. The catalogue file is now a blank field with a photograph attached. The figures on the hide are still there. They are no longer addressed by name. The Niemi family drum, in a wooden chest in a private dwelling north of the Tana River, is silent because no one in 5 generations was allowed to strike it. The figures on its hide are still there. They have never been addressed by name. The first silence is forgetting. The second silence is preservation. Both drums survived the 18th century. Both drums entered the 21st century intact. One of them is in a registration system that no longer remembers it. The other is in a household that has always known it was there and has never asked it to speak. The noaidi tradition holds that a drum is a passage, not a possession. It is opened by being struck. A drum that is never struck remains closed. The archive cannot decide which silence is worse. The silence of a museum that forgot what it held. Or the silence of a family that remembered too well. One drum was preserved until it lost its name. The other kept its name by never being opened. This file remains unresolved. Cross-reference. This file remains open. The Tromsø drum has been recatalogued as Object 2024 T17.4D, classification Sami noaidi drum, provenance unknown. The Niemi family drum has not been registered with any institution. It remains in the wooden chest, in the loft of the same household, where no one has been authorized to make it speak. End of file.